We'd like to thank our sponsor, Modern Campus. Find out how institutions are engaging learners across every stage of the journey at moderncampus.com/the5G-learner. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
You get an English degree, and what will you get with that degree? What will you be able to do with your life? What will you earn? It's not as clear. It's harder to put into words. That's something Stoner struggles with all his life. What matters to him are words, but he doesn't know how to put that feeling into words.
More than 60 years after its publication, John Williams' novel Stoner remains the kind of book academics love to talk about. Spanning from the early to mid-20th century, the novel charts the life of William Stoner, a farm boy who falls in love with literature and becomes a mostly uncelebrated professor at the University of Missouri. Through the eyes of Stoner, Williams delivers a book that is as concerned with the true nature of the university as it is with petty academic politics. So what does this novel, penned 6 decades ago by a longtime professor, have to say about the state of the academy today? We'll dive into that question with my colleague Nell Gluckman, a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and our special guest, Julie Schumacher, a novelist and professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. Julie is the author of a dozen books, including the national bestseller Dear Committee Members, an academic novel that won the Thurber Prize for American Humor. Julie, Nell, welcome to College Matters.
Thanks, Jack.
Thank you.
So I want to tell listeners up front, this will be a full spoiler discussion. So if you have not read Stoner, I might recommend reading it first and then listening to us. But if you have joined us in this sort of informal book club, welcome and thank you. We've heard from some listeners who really loved this novel, and I can't wait to dive into it today. Now, I want to start with you, though. So Stoner is a novel that people have been encouraging me to read for years because it's thought to say something essential about professors in the academy. What sort of picture do you think it paints of university life?
So the book follows the life of William Stoner, like you said, an assistant professor at the University of Missouri during the first half of the 20th century. He dies in the 1950s, and his world is really narrow, at least the physical world that he lives in. It exists between his office on campus, his home, which is a short walk away, classrooms, meeting rooms where he's talking to other faculty members and administrators, and then his walks through campus, through Jesse Hall and by those iconic University of Missouri columns that we have so many stock images of that we run above a lot of our higher ed stories. And so, yeah, it's like a classic on-campus world. It's filled with old brick buildings and stacks of books that people are lending each other, carrying between these classes and offices. And except for a few exceptions, Stoner basically spends his whole life, starting from when he's 19 years old, at the University of Missouri. So even though Stoner's world is very narrow, this is a book about a person's mind being expanded.
Yeah, we are thrust into this world of Mizzou, and John Williams, who wrote the novel, taught briefly at Mizzou. He spent most of his career at the University of Denver, but he did his PhD at Mizzou, and he has said that it's not a literal version of Mizzou, it's sort of a fictionalized version of it. Some interesting background about the novel, though, that I think is worth mentioning at the top, is that this novel was not successful when it was published. It initially sold something like 2,000 copies, went out of print pretty soon, and then it's reissued in 2006 and slowly gains critical acclaim. So there was kind of a revitalization around Stoner in 2013 when I think a lot of people read this book, except for me. And acclaimed authors like Ian McEwan and Bret Easton Ellis came out and praised it. This gave it energy. I think there's even a quote attributed to Tom Hanks saying this is a great novel. And then Williams died in 1994, though, before Stoner really achieved the success. He had his own success as an author. He won the National Book Award for Augustus, which was his final novel. But there is an interesting parallel here about Stoner, the life of a kind of unremarkable academic who certainly isn't appreciated in his time by his colleagues. Something to think about, that the life of the novel itself kind of shows that something that was undistinguished in the moment can later be appreciated. But Julie, I want to get your perspective on this genre in general, because you've written in it. The academic novel is sort of its own thing now. It's full of its own tropes and even cliches. cliches, but people are constantly drawn to the academy as a place to set great literature. What do you think it is about a college campus that makes this such a alluring literary setting?
Well, as Nell was saying, it is a very narrow world that Stoner lives in, both physically and in terms of, his distance from campus. He's a person who never has gone far from the very modest beginnings of his family farm. So it's a very small world on the one hand, but once he enters academia as a student and then a professor, he gets this feeling of enormity. Literature offers him this sense of a massive world, and he can't quite articulate why it matters to him so much. He can't quite understand it. So small on the one hand, absolutely boundless on the other. But I think, to answer the question more directly, academia is a weird little world. It is this cosseted, strange, enclosed environment. And because people take so long to study and to hone whatever area of research or creativity that they are involved in, you spend so many years by yourself in a library or an archive or doing some sort of research, then you're thrown into a pool of other people who've spent years by themselves, and you're told, everybody govern yourselves and get along. It's a nightmare, frankly.
Right.
In that sense, these are often odd, quirky, unsocialized people who are then put together in a group and told to organize and govern themselves and create an academic unit. And it creates a weirdness that is, I think, intriguing to a lot of people.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that. I don't know why, Julie, that the path toward the PhD is an isolating, almost lonely experience. It's not that these folks don't teach classes, but you spend a lot of time in the library, Carol. And then there's a real social game that comes with advancing within the academy, which I think the novel really presents in a compelling and interesting way. We've kind of alluded to the fact that Stoner is not to the manor born, that he grows up on a farm, and I think it's like a county clerk or someone who comes to his dad and says, there's a university up yonder that's teaching soil science, and your kid could come here, theoretically learn more advanced techniques for this farm, return home, and grace you with his new farming intellect. That's not what happens, of course. Stoner falls in love with medieval literature and Chaucer and all of these things and does not return to the family farm. But I am curious, since we talk so much on this podcast and at the Chronicle about the purpose of college, whether there's anything here about what the purpose of college is supposed to be, because it turns out to be very different than what Stoner thought it would be. I'd like to hear Nell's thoughts on that, but first I should probably tell listeners that Nell is joining us live from Manhattan, and there's construction going on. It's a big city. So if you hear that, that's a little cinema verite for you.
Yeah, I think Stoner sort of illustrates the purpose of college perfectly. He's sort of plucked off this farm by the state and given this education and a new avenue for development and improving himself and his family and his family's work. And so that's sort of one purpose. But then, he goes further and does what I think so many college professors, I would imagine, dream of doing, which is opening up new rooms in the student's brain. And he takes this literature class, like you mentioned, and sees this whole world of new possibilities, and then goes on to become a professor himself and spends his life dedicating himself to understanding this medieval literature and trying to impart what has enlightened him about it to other students. But at the same time, he has an arguably miserable life because gets embroiled in a petty sort of department politics over a PhD candidate, and that ends up messing with his teaching load and his whole personal life. And there's the scandal that ensues. And the book ends up also showing you the kind of petty underside of academic life as I've come to understand it. But Julie, you'd understand it a lot better.
Julie may have some insights here. You can't name names. They've been changed to protect the innocent.
Yeah, again, I think it's because you end up in this situation where you have people who are often, they don't come out of corporate America, where you have a boss who will tell you, you're here on Friday and you're going to do X, Y, and Z, and here's your due date. You are left in many ways to govern yourselves and each other. And it does create such friction, that there are these people for whom their research matters enormously. It is everything to them. And Stoner feels that his entire identity as a human being is wrapped up in academe and in being a teacher. It matters to him so much. Mm-hmm. And to be thwarted in that, to him, greatest, most significant thing by his enemy, Lomax,
right,
is just appalling. It's great to see him finally, at the end of the novel, be able to get his own back. He spends so many years being stepped upon and without necessarily fighting back in an aggressive way. He takes a very quiet step and decides, I will be dictated to no more.
Yeah.
It's a very quiet but a marvelous victory.
Yeah, he shows some backbone at long last, and it's done in a very interesting way. He uses the traditions and tools of the academy against his nemesis. For years, Lomax has relegated Stoner to teaching this entry-level composition course at very inconvenient times, and Stoner has essentially had to eat it. But in the end, he uses the principles of academic freedom to his advantage. He transforms his freshman comp course into what is essentially a medieval literature course in everything but name, and the students hate it, of course, and Lomax is forced to let Stoner teach what he wants to teach. But I want to go back to something Julie said a moment ago about the fact that professors work outside of the corporate world. They aren't used to being told what to do. They aren't comfortable with the real world. This is something that Dave Masters talks about in a big speech that he gives in a saloon. He describes the outside world as if it's an invasive species that's encroaching on the university and it has to be kept out at all cost. And I think the reader is meant to agree with Masters. We're supposed to worship him. He reminds me a lot of R.P. McMurphy in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He's this charismatic outlaw with all the answers. He is literally the master, so he demands our attention. And that's something that stood out to one of our listeners, too. Let's hear that voice memo.
I'm Caleb Zachrin from Brooklyn, New York, and I first read The Magnificent Stoner during COVID. I had recently graduated from college, and I wanted a novel that could help me reflect on my time. The thing that always stuck with me was the distinction between the three types of people in academia. There's the person who truly belongs, loving their object of study, truly believing the pursuits of a life of the mind. Then there's the academic who uses the university as a staging ground for more earthly pursuits. The final type is the cynical scholar, who needs the university as a sort of insane asylum. The first type needs the university to protect them from the world, and the world needs the university to protect it from the cynical type. What we get is a place filled with clever people with very different ends. To outsiders, they appear the same, but Stoner reveals the deep psychological diversity of scholars. Not all academics are motivated by the same ends. We often forget that when painting professors with a very broad brush today.
Yeah, so as Caleb points out, one of the things that novel does effectively is create these sort of types of academics for people to think about and behold. And Stoner is described as the dreamer. He's the person who sees the university as this place for enlightenment, who thinks that the answers are somewhere in some book he hasn't read. There's Gordon Finch, who we haven't talked about, who is Stoner's classmate, who later becomes dean of the college. I think he is described as having a more transactional view of the university. He collects student fees, and in exchange, they sort of prop him up in a system that protects him from a world in which he couldn't be successful because he's not too bright, apparently. And then there's Masters himself, who describes the university as an asylum. This is sort of an island of misfit toys where people like him would need to be locked up if they couldn't be in the academy spouting these crazy ideas. Julie, which one are you? I'm just curious.
I want to talk about which one Stoner is.
Okay, fair. Let's do that.
Because I think he's ultimately the purest. He's, in William's view, the purest of the three. Mm-hmm. Again, it takes him quite a while to figure out why literature matters to him. It just speaks to him. To me, the most terrific scene, the most important scene in the novel comes very early on, and that is when Stoner is in a class taught by the professor he admires most, Archer Sloane. Archer Sloane is teaching Shakespeare to his students, and he asks everyone, and particularly asks Stoner, the question, Mr. Shakespeare speaks to you across 300 years, Mr. Stoner. Do you hear him? And Stoner does hear him, but he doesn't know how to say so. He doesn't know how to articulate the emotions that are brought up in him. He doesn't know how to phrase anything in terms of the way that he feels, the way that literature has suddenly begun to matter to him. He has no idea what to do with this emotion because he's supposed to be a purely practical kind of guy studying agriculture. But literature has suddenly lit a fire in him. And so he's not able to say, yes, Mr. Shakespeare is speaking to me, but he's listening. He's listening. And even though the material, literature, and the arts matter to him enormously, it takes him a while to become a skilled instructor. He does fumble a bit at the beginning. He feels that his approach is very dry. It does take him quite a few years to become adept as an instructor. Eventually, he gets better at it. But I think ultimately, he's presented as the academic ideal. He is above the fray. He does not participate in real life in World War I or II, which costs him dearly in terms of his career. But what matters to him is the life of the mind. He's a real ivory tower kind of guy.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned the scene. I think that and the master scene in the saloon are really what the novel is trying to get at. And as you say, this is the moment of Stoner's intellectual awakening when he is in this class and somebody finally says to him, what do you think about this? And it's something that we talk about at the Chronicle a lot. You know, how do you motivate students? Well, one way, of course, is to actually call on them by name and ask them what they think. He's alluding to the immortality of literature by saying Shakespeare is speaking to you across hundreds of years. But I actually think the scene after that class is all kind of one scene. And what's really compelling to me about this is that Williams gets at something that is still kind of plaguing higher education, which is how do we explain the transcendent power of a true intellectual awakening? Like, it's very hard to explain to a state lawmaker or a parent or anyone else what exactly is happening in the self when this happens. And for Stoner, it really changes the way he perceives the world almost immediately. He describes himself as being sitting unmoving. He really can't leave the class when it's over. It's like a lightning bolt has hit him. And then when he walks out, he seems to have this heightened awareness of the natural world. He feels the chill of the late fall day, and he's looking at these bare, gnarled branches of the trees. He seems more in touch with the natural world than he was before. And then he says, he's looking at his fellow students and he says he looked at them curiously as if he had not seen them before and felt very distant from them and very close to them. And he later says that in that instant, he becomes someone other than who he'd been before. All of this stuff amounts to that he is having some kind of transformational experience that, as you've mentioned a couple times, Julie, he can't describe. This is the difficulty. He really, really wishes that he could transmit to his students and even his colleagues what is going on with him. And at times it really seems like Sloane is the only one who gets it, that he's in love, you know, that this is this ineffable thing. I just think that's very interesting for a novel this old, that we're still kind of fighting over this, that how do you describe what makes education a transcendent experience if it's not vocational? And the novel seems really preoccupied with that question. Did you respond to that scene too now?
Yeah, so that's the scene that kind of starts the rest of the book, even though he goes on to have like what to me sounds like a very difficult life with every time he kind of starts to figure things out, they sort of fall apart. But he begins this journey in that moment of self-realizing. He kind of becomes himself. And in the end of his life, many chapters later, there's this peacefulness that he has, because he sort of says that he knew who he was and he had this kind of realization about not like an epiphany, but like a lifelong self-actualization that brings him some comfort, I think. And I could read part of that.
Yeah.
This is towards the very end. He knows that he's dying at this point and says a sense of his own identity came upon him with a sudden force, and he felt the power of it. He was himself, and he knew what he had been. And so even though the academy that he's dedicated his life to is an asylum, it's an administrative state, he has done what he set out to do, I think. And yeah, I think that that's kind of optimistic in some ways.
That is the grandiose vision behind this, but I don't want to suggest that there's also not a lot in here about petty academic politics, which play a role. So the flip side of that coin, that this is a place where people really find their true selves, is that this is a place where people eat each other alive. And I know that doesn't happen at your university, Julie, but I am curious what you think of this fictional portrayal.
That's the power of the novel, I think, that on the one hand, there is this idealistic, marvelous, ineffable learning that can happen that is a transcendent experience and hard to explain to state legislatures, parents, et cetera, who are paying an increasing amount of money in tuition. The fact that education is increasingly expensive makes it difficult to say, but your child or your state resident can have a transcendent experience and become him or herself. Well, that's hard to sell to anyone.
Did you have a sense of whether Williams puts forward a theory of sort of who gets ahead and why in the academy?
Yeah, I think in the portrait of Finch and Lomax, Finch becoming the department chair and being a friendly, well-meaning sort of guy who doesn't exercise much power, just wants everybody to get along and make his life easier. And then Lomax, who is a bitter, angry, brilliant person who is determined that no one will cross him. And they are in an English department at the U of Missouri. They're earning modest salaries, low prestige. Because the stakes are low, the fighting gets very hot. Mm-hmm. Again, this mix of both the glorious, transcendent academic learning environment and the bitter infighting because of the stakes that faculty members experience makes for a very difficult sort of environment.
Yeah. And a lot of advancement, at least as portrayed here, has very little to do with your scholarship or even your teaching acumen.
No.
It seems like Stoner's great sin is having not enlisted. People frown upon that.
He's not a political animal, Stoner, and that costs him.
Right.
Lomax knows how to play dirty when it comes to department politics. And Stoner just wants to be a good scholar and to be a good teacher. That's what matters to him.
Yeah. Lomax is described as having his finger in the president's nose and leads him around like a cut bull.
Yeah, yeah.
So he has a relationship within the hierarchy that protects him.
Yeah. When Nell read from the end of the novel, I kept thinking at various spots in Stoner, but also at the end of Middlemarch, the way that Dorothea's life is described. And I just want to read that paragraph.
Yeah. You made it to the end of Middlemarch. Congratulations.
I did. I love that novel. The growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. That things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to those who lived faithfully a hidden life and now rest in unvisited tombs. And I feel like that encapsulates Stoner perfectly. You know, he lived faithfully a hidden life. He's memorialized by his colleagues by a manuscript delivered to the library. Nobody's going to remember him. His scholarship is very minor, but that's heroic, I think, in the eyes of the author.
Stick around. We'll be back in a minute. Something fundamental has changed in higher education. Institutions now serve 5 generations of learners simultaneously, each with different goals, expectations, and pathways. Modern Campus calls this the 5G learning era, because the future won't belong to institutions that simply enroll students. It will belong to those that build lifelong learning relationships. Learn more at moderncampus.com/the5G learner. Nell, do you like Stoner? Do you like this guy? Do you like this book?
You're rooting for him. I was rooting for him throughout the story. I don't know if I had like a strong like or dislike of Stoner in the novel. I hadn't even really thought about that. I think I just wanted him to find what he was looking for and get a foothold somewhere, whether it was in his relationship with his daughter or a good teaching load or publishing that book, which even though, yes, what he did wasn't meaningful in a grand sense, he says he leaves a bit of himself in the book that he published, and that's a small triumph for him.
Yeah.
And I was like sort of amused by the moments where he leans into this curmudgeonly caricature that has developed around him on campus, and sometimes he finds ways to like use that to his advantage and hype it up a little bit. I thought that was funny.
The gossip about his on-campus affair
Right.
kind of makes him more interesting to people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he becomes this sort of eccentric, which I think brings us to the subject of women in the novel. There's a largely favorable portrayal of Catherine Driscoll, the young instructor that Stoner has an affair with. But like a lot of novels written by men in the 60s, Stoner has been criticized for its depictions of women. What do you think about that, Julie?
Yeah, I have trouble with Edith, Stoner's wife. He should never have married her. She should never have married him. I think Edith is created by the author in part to show that the victories Stoner experiences in his life are small. They're meaningful to him, but they are small. And they're small because they're in the context of a terrible marriage to a woman who is extremely unpleasant, a relationship with his daughter that begins in a lovely way. He's a primary caretaker for his daughter for quite a few years when she's very young, but that sours quickly as his wife turns the daughter, Grace, against him. So the women in the book, other than Catherine, the person with whom he has an affair, they're really unpleasant people. And I think they are, rather than being drawn as full characters unto themselves, they are, Edith in particular, drawn to make the point that his life is difficult. Edith makes his life difficult. She is a difficult person and in some ways difficult to believe for at least, I think, a female reader in 2026.
Yeah, I think we might have a listener who agrees with you, Julie. Let's hear that voice memo.
Hi, my name is Tron Sattler LeBlanc, and I'm in Pittsford, New York. I struggled most with the character of Edith, who felt less like a fully developed woman than a miserable caricature. She is given everything she was taught to want and almost nothing she needs to become whole. Is this a deliberate portrait of what social expectations did to women, or does the novel reduce her to a device for generating sympathy for Stoner? Would we see William differently if Edith were afforded the same complexity and compassion?
What did you make of the portrayal of women now?
Yeah, we never really learn why Edith is so difficult other than that she's sort of a princess who's the daughter of a banker and she had everything, and now she's sort of disappointed at the lot in life as a wife of an assistant professor at a university that she's landed with. And she has deep problems and deep sadness, and it's not totally clear why.
I think she's still mad she didn't get to go to Europe, probably, but
Yeah.
She's very vindictive.
Yeah.
Stoner does ask her at one point, "You truly hate me, don't you, Edith?" It seems like she does. There's an odd moment toward the end of the book, too, when his daughter Grace grows up and becomes clearly an alcoholic. And Stoner's only thought about it ultimately is, he was glad she had the drinking.
I know.
It was something to comfort her. And I thought, wow.
That shocked me too.
That reads oddly in 2026 as well.
That made me even sadder than the Edith relationship. Was this beautiful start that they had when his daughter was young, like you said, Julie, and then Edith kind of turns her against him and tries to make her into a popular girl, and she clearly has a really difficult teenage life trying to conform to whatever her mother is doing to her, and then ends up escaping by getting pregnant, but ultimately having to give her child to her in-laws. And we imagine that she sort of wastes away. And I thought that was so sad.
And it seems like some of that relationship is inserted to give an opportunity for some of the class commentary. Even though the father is a banker who's not as successful as he'd like to be, they're from the city. He's a banker. When Stoner first meets him, he says, I realized I had no prospects, even though he's on the path to become a professor. So I do think it creates a little bit of that sort of class tension between them. And interestingly, Edith, I think, has an uncle who was a university trustee. So the people who are the power brokers in society and even in the university come from places other than farms, which seems to be something that the novel cares about. I do think that Catherine Driscoll is also, I mean, she's probably the most sympathetic figure in the novel in terms of women, but is kind of a manic pixie dream girl. She's just there sort of to reflect Stoner's brilliance back to him in a lot of ways. He admires her work, of course, but I thought it was pretty thinly drawn myself. The other thing that we heard from a listener was that the disciplines are narrow here. We're once again in an English department, which may have to do with the fact that a lot of novelists worked in English departments. But, I can't think of a lot of novels in this genre that are set in the engineering department. And we had a listener, Jesse Mosqueda, who commented on this. Let's hear that voicemail.
Hello, my name is Jesse. I'm from California. One thing I think this novel highlights about higher ed is that our cultural representations of higher ed generally and the university specifically are often told from the perspective of the humanities and often literary studies specifically. This is not a new observation, and the reasons why have been written about. But what I was thinking while reading this novel is, how would it read differently if it was told from the perspective of, say, an econ professor or an engineering professor or an agricultural sciences professor, to use the example from the book? And how would our understandings of higher ed look different generally if the representations moved away from the humanities? Thank you. Love the podcast.
Thanks to Jesse for that observation. I think it's a good one, Julie. I don't know if you can do some on-the-spot fan fiction for us, but Stoner the engineer, would that have worked?
I don't think it would have worked. The easy response to that question is to just point to the fact that English departments are full of people who write books, whereas engineers build bridges or they design, I don't know what they design. I don't know what engineers do. But I imagine there can be a very odd insular culture for those who work in a post office or those who work in a hair salon. But those people are busy working in the post office and doing hair salon stuff, whereas novelists like myself are hoping to write novels and write what you know, having a certain power and a certain draw. But it's also an issue that in the humanities, you're not dealing with what is a more immediately practical education. You will graduate with an engineering degree and you will go work for this firm and you will design things that you can see and that others automatically know how to value. You get an English degree, and what will you get with that degree? What will you be able to do with your life? What will you earn? It's not as clear. It's harder to put into words. That's something Stoner struggles with all his life. What matters to him are words, but he doesn't know how to put that feeling into words.
I think the novel is very interested in the relationship between the body and the mind. Stoner is kind of a nerd. He expects to find the secret of life in a book. But at the same time, the novel is hyper-focused on physicality and people's hands in particular. People are seen holding books. They're staring at their own fingers. They're holding each other or trying to hold each other. There's a moment between Stoner and Catherine Driscoll that I think is really important that fuses these ideas together. They talk about how they had been brought up to believe that the life of the mind and the life of the senses are separate, but through their relationship, they're finding that one can actually intensify the other, and this is a revelation to them. So it feels like Williams is making an argument that sensuality and human experience are part of the scholar's necessary evolution, that you can't just bury your head in books and expect to connect with the sublime through a sonnet. You have to seek it out in an almost primal way. And Stoner and Catherine are discovering that.
Yeah, that's an idealized relationship. And it is very satisfying, though, to see, number one, Stoner briefly happy, just really happy, not only romantically and emotionally in his affair, but also intellectually, that he's able to articulate what he feels when he's with Catherine. And he's able to accept both her intellect and her love for him. It's something he's never received elsewhere. So the fact that the two of those parts of his existence can join is, I think, enormously important to him. Mm-hmm. And in terms of hands, I was struck by the end of the book, too. In the final paragraph, he's holding a book as he's dying, and it's as if the pages of the book were alive. He's dead, but the book is moving. It falls to the floor. And I thought, oh, literature outlives character, it outlives us. It holds truths that matter beyond an individual's existence. Stoner understands that. The author understands that.
Yeah, I mean, the ending kind of devastated me, but also felt totally appropriate. I don't know how you felt about it, Nell.
I thought it was kind of beautiful. His last vision, whether it's a vision or it's something that actually happens before that moment with the book that Julie talked about, is seeing happy students walking across a lawn. And it's this like idyllic picture of university life that we've been talking about. And, you know, these are people at the beginning of their lives, there to learn. And that book, I think, that dropped to the ground is his book that he wrote. And so it's the piece of him that he's kind of sending forward into time. And I would just say, going back to the discussion of humanities and why so many books and movies and TV shows take place in humanities departments, I think there might be a bit of a fascination with it, just aside from the fascination that authors might have with it, living in these departments. But this curiosity about what it would mean for any person to spend their life simply learning and studying and trying to reach some kind of enlightenment that I think a lot of people maybe are resentful of, and there's a lot of animosity and intense feeling that this is a waste of society's resources right now in particular. But I think there is a fascination with it as well, and a curiosity about like, what would that be like, and how would that be, that makes it a good setting for a novel or even a TV show.
I think another perennial conversation we have in the academy is damn kids today. And we've been talking a lot about how students lack reading capacity, they lack reading endurance. But there are periods of time, it seems now, when Stoner feels very connected to his students.
Yeah, I thought this was such a interesting part of the book. It was towards the end when World War II has ended and the veterans from that war are coming back and they're coming to campus. And this is something, as a higher ed reporter for a long time, this is a phase in the history of higher education that I hear about a lot. The GI Bill is never mentioned, but the GI Bill was so important to the formation of the university in the later part of the 20th century. This is an infusion of people and money because the government is funding their education in part. And this is when I think, at least the reputation that colleges had for a long time of being engines of social mobility kind of crystallizes and develops, and when a lot of the buildings that are now on campuses are built and that sort of thing. And I'd never really seen it depicted in literature or in any kind of art, but Stoner talks about it as this almost perfect time in his teaching career, and it's towards the end. He says, "The years immediately following the end of the Second World War were the best years of his teaching, and they were in some ways the happiest years of his life. Veterans of that war descended upon the campus and transformed it, bringing to it a quality of life that it had not had before, an intensity and turbulence that amounted to a transformation. He worked harder than he had ever worked. The students, strange in their maturity, were intensely serious and contemptuous of triviality. Innocent of fashion or custom, they came to their studies as Stoner had dreamed that a student might, as if those studies were life itself and not a specific means to an end. So this is what Stoner sees as the purpose of university, not a way to get a job, but it's life itself. And he's so happy to have these students who have gone through something terrible and have this perspective on life and its meaning. And they kind of, for the first time and maybe only time, are seeing these studies the way he sees it.
And Williams was a beneficiary of the GI Bill. He was in World War II, and I think saw some harrowing things for quite some time during the war, was traumatized by it, and his life was turned around by the GI Bill and the ability, when his family could never have paid for it, to get an excellent education.
The one student we meet who we spend the most time with, though, is not great. Charles Walker, who is this PhD student who sort of forces his way into Stoner's class, has a tight relationship with Lomax, and then just proves to be just a consummate BSer. And Stoner wants to flunk him, of course. What did you make of the portrayal of Walker, Julie?
Well, there's one moment when someone, I think Finch, says, "What is it between Walker and Lomax anyway?" And it makes you think that they're having a romantic relationship of some sort, but that suspicion is quashed immediately. Don't even think of it or some such.
Almost like it can't be uttered.
Yeah, it can't be spoken. But Lomax's defense of this ultimate BSer is striking, and it's what causes the huge division between the two men. I mean, it shows the difference between them. Stoner has Catherine Driscoll, this adoring, again, pure of heart sort of person who loves him. And Lomax, who is described as, he has a beautiful face, but he is physically challenged, physically handicapped in some way. And he's sort of matched with Charles Walker, who also refers to himself as disabled and claims that Stoner has poked fun at him or belittled him because of a limp that he has.
When in reality, he really literally hasn't done his homework.
Yeah. But he's very good. I mean, he's smart and he's good at BSing. He's a good talker.
He is, and this gets at like who gets ahead and why. Is Walker ultimately going to be someone who rises with the academy because he's got a silver tongue? I love how he has this one fact that he wields against Stoner all the time, which is that Shakespeare didn't know much Latin or Greek. Implication being, who are we to argue that having any appreciation for language or anything actually matters? Even Shakespeare himself didn't have such a thing. And, he struck me at times, if we were to draw a contemporary parallel, as kind of the worst stereotype of almost like the MAGA bro. And it's not a political thing, but it is. There's a moment when Stoner finally says out loud, like, yeah, I'm going to give you an F in this course. And Walker's response is, very well, sir, one must be prepared to suffer for one's beliefs, as if this is a political persecution because Walker is taking such an outsiderish view of medieval literature that it's, not tolerated by polite society. I thought that was an interesting parallel in a novel that doesn't have a lot of overt politics other than academic politics.
Mm-hmm. He's a thoroughly aggravating character. And I think anyone who teaches has known one student who bedevils them and gets the better of them at one moment or another.
Yes, I'm sure every professor can relate to that. Before we close out, I'd like to return to a big question that this novel is asking. It's also a question that our country is asking right now, which is higher education worth it? Is Stoner's life better because he attended a university? Or might he have been just as fulfilled on the family farm? Now, what do you think about that?
Well, he does talk about his parents' end of life. And at one point he goes back to the farm. This is after his relationship with his parents they've sort of become estranged since his marriage to Edith, which was also just devastating. The scenes where the families come together and his parents sort of retreat. I think, he describes their life and death as miserable. Like they are working with the soil, then they return to soil. Maybe there's something sort of beautiful about that, but they're not really living for anything. And I think he feels that he's gotten out of that and had a better life than he would have.
Julie, you think Stoner was better off going to college based on the alternative?
It's definitely worth it for Stoner. It changes his life for the better. And it takes a while for him to understand that. His parents will probably never understand it, but it has felt to him like the one thing that will make his life make sense, that will make him feel that he is not going to simply be buried in a hill on a farm and disappear the way that his parents will disappear. It is going to make him feel that he's made a mark, even if very slight, on a few of the students that he has taught, a few of the people who have read his work. It's a small victory, but it's a victory that matters to him.
Yeah, I agree completely. And in at least the edition I read, there is an interview or a quote from John Williams himself, who describes Stoner as a hero, as someone who really understood at a fundamental level that his job was important. And I know that Edith is sort of a cardboard character, but I think she's presented as a foil to Stoner in this way, because when Stoner is saying, we may have to move, we may have to leave because of this feud that I'm having with Lomax, she says it in relation to that, but it seems like it's a bigger thing, which she says, honestly, things are so important to you. What difference could it make? And it seems like that is really the question of the novel. Does any of this make a difference? And the problem the novel is wrestling with is that the difference that education makes is deeply personal, as we've talked about. It isn't easily put into words. It may not help you get a job, but it could save your soul. I feel like that's the note, however bittersweet, that we're kind of left with.
Yeah. There are moments at the early part of the novel when his father suggests maybe you should go to the agricultural college. And Stoner's response is always, well, what do you think? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Later, Grace, his daughter, I'm pregnant, my husband has been killed in the war. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There are all these people who feel that things don't matter, but Stoner feels ultimately that his life has mattered. Not in a huge way, but it is enough. It has mattered.
I think that even Masters kind of sums it up in the very beginning when he has this kind of cynical view of the university that we've talked about. But in the end of that section, he says, after all that, we do no harm, we say what we want, and we get paid for it. And that's a triumph of virtue, or pretty damn close to it. I think it's like, that's about as good as you can get, is a triumph of virtue, and that's what we're here for. And I think that's kind of what Stoner set out to do, lead a virtuous life.
Well, I think we have revealed our editorial position on this question. This is College Matters from the Chronicle.
That's right.
So thank you so much both for coming and talking about this. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jack.
College Matters from the Chronicle is a production of the Chronicle of Higher Education, the nation's leading independent newsroom covering colleges. If you like the show, please leave us a review or invite a friend to listen. And remember to follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. You can find an archive of every episode, all of our show notes, and much more at chronicle.com/College Matters. If you'd like, drop us a note at collegematters@chronicle.com. We are produced by Mia Sullivan. Our Chronicle producer is Fernanda Zamudio Suarez. Our podcast artwork is by Cottrell Thomas. Special thanks to our colleagues Brock Reed, Joshua Hatch, Jillian Atelsik, Sarah Brown, Ron Coddington, Scott Seymour, Carmen Mendoza, and all of the people at the Chronicle who make this show possible. I'm Jack Stripling. Thanks for listening. There's another show I want to tell you about. It's called Learning Curve, and it's for anyone grappling with one of the biggest questions in education right now. What does it even mean to teach and learn when AI can do so much of the work for us? Learning Curve is hosted by my colleague Jeff Young, who also writes the Chronicle's new Jagged Intelligence newsletter about AI on campus. If you listen to Learning Curve, you'll hear from some memorable characters. A college student who demanded her money back after she caught her professor using AI, and a former university president who is trying to redesign college for an AI era. The show is full of insights to help cut through the hype and the fear around artificial intelligence. Check out Learning Curve wherever you get your podcasts. We'd like to thank our sponsor, Modern Campus. Find out how institutions are engaging learners across every stage of the journey at moderncampus.com/the5G learner.